Princess Amelia was a little girl, only 8 years old, but she lived in a world unlike any other child. Her home was the royal palace, a massive building made of shining stone, with tall towers and sweeping gardens filled with flowers that bloomed in every color imaginable. The palace had been built centuries ago, and its walls were full of stories of kings, queens, battles, and celebrations. Amelia had spent her whole life there, growing up surrounded by the finest luxuries money could buy. Yet she wasn't a spoiled child. Far from it. Amelia was a curious and sharp-minded girl with an unusual ability to observe the world around her. She was loved by everyone in the kingdom, from the nobles in the grand halls to the humble gardeners who worked in the palace grounds. She had a natural charm, a smile so bright that it could light up even the darkest corners of the palace. Her laughter echoed through the grand corridors, bringing joy to all who heard it. Yet behind her cheerful demeanor was a mind that never stopped working, a mind that noticed the tiniest details most people overlooked. Unlike most children, Amelia was often found not playing with toys or running around the palace gardens, but sitting quietly in the royal library, reading books about the world. She was fascinated by history, by the stories of her ancestors and the way they had ruled the kingdom. Her parents, the king and queen, were often busy with royal duties, and Amelia was left to entertain herself, but she didn't mind. She loved learning. In fact, she was better at learning the royal protocols, the rules of court life, and even the art of diplomacy than many adults who served at the palace. However, it wasn't just books that Amelia was good at. She had a unique gift, something that set her apart from others. She could read people, not in the way a book tells a story, but in the way she could tell what a person was feeling by the slightest change in their face or movements. Amelia's sharp eyes and attentive nature had allowed her to notice things that others would miss, like how the guards' faces would change when a particular guest arrived at the palace, or how certain servants seemed to be watching her more closely than they should. These observations were nothing more than innocent curiosity at first, but over time they became more than that. Amelia realized she could sense things that others might never notice. Today was a special day. It was the day of a royal ceremony, a grand event where nobles and guests from all over the kingdom gathered to celebrate a momentous occasion. The great hall of the palace was adorned with banners of gold and purple, the colors of the royal family, and the air was filled with the sweet scent of roses and lilies. Amelia was dressed in a beautiful gown, her long hair styled in a way that made her look like a miniature version of her mother, the queen. She stood proudly beside her parents, smiling at the crowd of guests, yet something didn't feel quite right. The crowd was large, with hundreds of people gathered in the hall. They whispered to one another, exchanged pleasantries, and congratulated the royal family on the occasion. Yet Amelia's eyes were darting around the room, carefully watching each face, each movement. Her gaze was calm, but deep inside her, a feeling of unease had begun to grow. She didn't know why, but something felt out of place. As the ceremony went on, the music played softly in the background, and people clinked glasses in celebration. But amidst all the joy and laughter, Amelia noticed a figure in the crowd who stood out. Someone who seemed to be watching the royal family just a little too closely. At first, it was easy to dismiss. People always stared at royalty, some with admiration, others with envy. But this man was different. His posture was stiff and his eyes never left the king and queen. He seemed too focused. Amelia's heart began to race. She had seen this man before, but she couldn't place where. She knew something was wrong. The man didn't belong here, not in the way the guests did. His clothes were ordinary, not the finely tailored robes that most of the other nobles wore. His face was hidden partially by a dark cloak. But his eyes, Amelia could see his eyes, sharp and calculating, glinted with something she couldn't understand. She looked around, trying to make sense of what she was feeling. Everyone else in the room seemed oblivious to the man, too busy with their conversations and celebrations to notice the quiet stranger in their midst. But not Amelia. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was there for a reason that was not good. It was then that she remembered something her father had told her not long ago. "Amelia, always trust your instincts. They are your greatest guide," he had said. At the time, she hadn't fully understood what he meant. But now, standing in the middle of the royal hall, feeling the weight of the stranger's gaze upon her, Amelia knew exactly what he had meant. Her eyes flicked toward the guards who were stationed at the entrances to the hall. their stern faces scanning the room as they always did. Captain Elias, the head of the royal guard, stood tall by the door, his armor gleaming in the candlelight. He was a man of great discipline, known for his loyalty and unwavering commitment to the royal family. He never allowed anyone to breach the palace without permission. Amelia had always admired him. He was calm, controlled, and respected by everyone. But now her thoughts returned to the figure in the crowd. As she looked closer, Amelia could see his hand shift slightly beneath his cloak. He was moving in a way that felt deliberate, as though he were preparing to do something. A cold shiver ran down Amelia's spine. She knew it wasn't just a feeling anymore, it was real. There was danger in the hall. Her heart pounded, and for a brief moment Amelia considered what to do. She wasn't supposed to break protocol. She wasn't supposed to speak to the guards during such a formal event. But in that moment, nothing else mattered. Her instincts were screaming at her to act. Without thinking, Amelia glanced toward Captain Elias. Her eyes locked with his for a fleeting second. Then she gave a very subtle signal, a small tilt of her head, her hand moving ever so slightly in a way that only he would notice. It was a signal she had learned to use in private with her family, a gesture meant to convey danger without speaking a word. Elias, standing stoically in his position, caught her gaze. His sharp eyes narrowed as he saw the princess's signal. Something in her expression told him that something was wrong, and that he needed to act. He could feel it too, the tension in the air, the way the room had suddenly grown colder. His instincts were telling him the same thing. As the ceremony continued, the rest of the room remained oblivious. But for Captain Elias, everything had changed. He had to act, and he had to do it quickly. Captain Elias had always been the picture of discipline. Tall, strong, and stern, he had served in the royal guard for years, following every protocol to the letter. His job was simple in theory: protect the royal family at all costs, no matter the danger. Yet in all his years of service, nothing had ever made him question his training or his duty. He had never once broken the rules, never once stepped out of line. Until today. When Princess Amelia's eyes met his across the crowded hall, Elias felt an immediate shift within himself. He had served the royal family long enough to understand that everything about the palace was steeped in order, rules that governed every action, every word spoken, and every decision made. There was no room for error. A guard was never supposed to approach the royal family unless summoned directly by the king or queen. And yet, there was something in the princess's eyes, something in her gaze that made Elias pause. For a split second, he thought he might be imagining things. Perhaps it was just his mind playing tricks on him, trying to explain why the princess's look had unsettled him so deeply. But when he caught the small tilt of Amelia's head and the almost invisible movement of her hand, he knew it wasn't just his imagination. She was trying to tell him something important, and it was clear she didn't want to say it aloud. Elias's eyes quickly scanned the room, his instincts kicking in. The figure in the crowd was still there, standing at the edge of the celebration. He was tall and gaunt, his features sharp beneath the hood of his cloak. His eyes never left the royal family. There was something unsettling about the way he stood, too still, too purposeful. He wasn't just another noble guest admiring the splendor of the palace. He was waiting for something. Elias felt a surge of unease wash over him. Could it be? Was there a threat among the guests? He quickly dismissed the idea. The palace was heavily guarded. The royal family had lived through countless celebrations and nothing had ever gone wrong. But this time felt different. Without thinking, he moved closer to the princess. His hand gripped the hilt of his sword as he made his way through the crowd. He was careful not to draw attention to himself. People around him laughed, talked, and clinked glasses, unaware of the danger lurking just a few feet away. But Elias wasn't fooled. His job was to see what others couldn't, to anticipate the worst before it ever happened. As he approached the royal family, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He had seen many things in his years of service: attempted coups, assassination plots, and even the occasional spy who tried to slip into the palace undetected. But never had he felt so certain, so deeply unsettled as he did right now. The princess's signal had sent a message that he couldn't ignore. If she was warning him, then something was happening, something that needed immediate attention. He reached the side of the royal family and paused for a moment, his eyes scanning the crowd again. The stranger was still there, moving now, weaving through the guests with deliberate steps. He was making his way toward the back of the hall. The people around him didn't seem to notice or care, too absorbed in the festivities to pay any mind to one lone figure slipping through the crowd. But Elias was no longer willing to wait. The princess's warning had been clear. If she was afraid, he had to act on it. He couldn't risk the possibility that he was wrong. He had to protect her, protect them all, no matter what. "Your Highness," Elias whispered, bowing low before the king and queen. "I must speak with you privately." The king and queen, who had been too busy greeting their guests to notice anything out of the ordinary, exchanged a brief glance. The king nodded, understanding the urgency in Elias's voice. "Of course, Captain. What is it?" Amelia, standing quietly beside her parents, watched the exchange closely. Her heart was pounding in her chest. She knew that Captain Elias had recognized her signal, and she trusted him completely. But now she had to wait and see what he would do next. It wasn't enough just to sense the danger. It was up to Elias to take action. As Elias led the king and queen to a quieter corner of the hall, Amelia's eyes followed the strange figure again. He was moving closer to the royal family now, his pace quickening. Something about the way he moved made her stomach twist. He was getting too close. She could feel the tension building, like the calm before a storm. Without thinking, Amelia made her way toward Elias. She couldn't stand still any longer. She had to help him. She had to warn him about the stranger. Her feet moved quickly, and she found herself beside Elias within moments, her small hand tugging at his sleeve. "Captain," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the noise of the crowd. "It's him. He's the one." Elias turned, his sharp eyes meeting Amelia's. She didn't need to say any more. Her gaze told him everything he needed to know. He nodded grimly, acknowledging her silent message. "I'll handle it, Your Highness," Elias said, his voice steady but low. He then turned toward the royal guards at the back of the hall, signaling them to move into position. The strange figure was now within arm's reach of the king and queen. The guards, unaware of the immediate danger, were still positioned too far away to act. Elias's heart raced. He had to make sure nothing happened. He couldn't allow anyone to get close to the royal family, especially not now. In a swift motion, Elias moved toward the stranger, his steps deliberate but quiet. The crowd seemed to part for him, giving him the space he needed to reach the man. The closer he got, the more Elias's suspicions grew. This was no ordinary guest. There was a coldness about him, an unnatural stillness that made Elias's instincts scream that something was wrong. Just as he reached the stranger, the man turned, his face hidden beneath the shadow of his hood. Elias's hand instinctively gripped the hilt of his sword as he stepped closer, his eyes never leaving the figure. "You there?" Elias commanded, his voice firm. "You need to come with me." The man didn't flinch, didn't even seem surprised by the sudden command. He simply raised his head slowly, his eyes meeting Elias's. There was a coldness in them, a calculation that made Elias's blood run cold. The man opened his mouth to speak, but before he could utter a word, the sharp sound of a whistle echoed through the hall. It was a signal, one that Elias recognized immediately. Something had happened. The danger was real. There was no time to waste. Without another word, Elias grabbed the man's arm and pulled him away from the crowd. His mind raced, and as he moved, he could hear the growing commotion around him. Something was happening, something that would change everything. Captain Elias's heart pounded in his chest as he gripped the man's arm tightly. The stranger, still eerily calm, showed no sign of resistance. It was as though he knew exactly what was coming, as if he had expected this moment. The guards quickly surrounded them, closing off any chance of escape. There was a tense silence, broken only by the whispers of the onlookers who had begun to take notice of the unfolding scene. Elias didn't hesitate. His instincts were sharper than ever, guiding his every move. He had to act quickly, but he also knew that any misstep could lead to disaster. The stranger was not an ordinary guest. Elias could feel it in the air. The man wasn't just there for the royal ceremony. He was there for something far more sinister. As the guards moved in, the stranger's eyes scanned the room, taking in the faces of the palace guests. His expression was unreadable, but there was a coldness in his gaze that sent a chill down Elias's spine. He wasn't scared. He wasn't worried. It was as though he knew he was only a step away from whatever his goal was. "Let go of me," the man muttered in a low voice, but his words held no authority. He wasn't trying to make a demand. He was merely stating a fact. There was something unnerving about how passive he was, how little resistance he put up. Elias ignored him, tightening his grip as he moved the man toward the back of the hall. The crowd was starting to murmur, and Elias could feel their eyes on him. But he couldn't afford to be distracted. Every moment was crucial. The royal family's safety was his responsibility. No matter what, he had to ensure they were safe. The stranger's hooded cloak fluttered as Elias walked quickly, the man's feet dragging behind him. The hallway was quieter now, the sounds of the festivities becoming a distant hum as they moved away from the main event. They passed several servants and royal staff who were all looking at them curiously, but Elias held his position, determined not to show any sign of doubt. "Where are you taking me?" the man asked, his voice now tinged with irritation, but there was still no urgency in his tone. It was as though he wasn't truly worried about what was happening. That bothered Elias more than anything. Someone with nothing to fear was dangerous. "I'm taking you to a secure room," Elias replied, his voice firm and cold. "We need to figure out who you are and why you're here." The stranger didn't respond. Instead, he shifted his weight slightly as if testing Elias's grip. But Elias wasn't about to let go. He had seen too many dangerous situations in his time as a guard. He had seen people try to escape when they were cornered, seen them become desperate and unpredictable. This man, however, seemed perfectly composed. Elias could feel a bead of sweat forming on his brow, but he pushed the discomfort aside. He couldn't afford to think about it now. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. As they moved down the narrow corridor toward the secure room, Elias's mind raced. Why hadn't the stranger tried to fight back? Why was he so calm? Could it be that he had planned for this? Was this all part of some larger scheme? The uncertainty was eating at him. And then in the middle of his thoughts, the man spoke again. "You're making a mistake," the stranger said, his voice so soft that Elias almost didn't hear it. "You don't know who I am." Elias's grip tightened even more. "I don't care who you are," he said sharply. "What matters is that you're a threat to the royal family, and I intend to make sure you don't get anywhere near them." The stranger let out a small, almost amused chuckle. "You think you're the one in control here? You have no idea what's really going on." Those words, cold and cryptic, made Elias stop dead in his tracks. The man was right. There was so much about this situation that didn't make sense. How had the princess known about the threat? Why had she been the first to see the danger before anyone else? What was he missing? Before he could process his thoughts further, the stranger's voice interrupted again. "You should be careful, Captain. There's more at play here than you realize. Things are about to change, and you won't be able to stop it." Elias hesitated for just a second, caught off guard by the stranger's words. How did he know Elias's name? How did he know anything about the palace? He had to admit he was beginning to feel more uncertain than he had ever felt in his life. But there was no time for doubt. He had a job to do, and he had to see it through. He shook his head and continued walking, the sound of his boots echoing off the walls. Behind him, the stranger remained eerily quiet, but Elias could feel his eyes boring into the back of his head. The tension was thick in the air, and Elias could sense that they were getting closer to something much bigger than he had anticipated. As they reached the secured room, Elias motioned for the guards to open the door. The room was small and plain, just a simple space with stone walls, a table in the center, and a few chairs. It was the perfect place to interrogate someone without any distractions. The stranger was pushed inside, and the door was quickly closed behind them. Elias stood in front of the man, his sword still at his side, ready to act at a moment's notice. He studied the stranger carefully, trying to read his expression. But there was nothing to read. The man's face remained calm, his features like stone, betraying no hint of emotion. It was frustrating. He wasn't getting any closer to understanding what was going on. "Now we're going to have a little chat," Elias said, trying to keep his voice steady. "And you're going to tell me everything." The man met his gaze with cold, unflinching eyes. He wasn't intimidated. He wasn't scared, and that, more than anything else, told Elias that this was not going to be as simple as he had hoped.